Let's go. Here is my story. Diamonds are a girl's best friend, right? Not always. Whoever asks you for fancy, shiny things while you're doing the very best you can, maybe doesn't always have your best interest at heart. Today on our space, college sweethearts turn first story sour. Wife left me for a rich older man and later came back begging for reconciliation. Hi, 25 male, met my wife Brenda, 25 female, in college when we were still in our early 22nd. We hit it off during our college second year. After dating for 3 years, we decided to marry. Our parents cautioned us not to make a hasty decision because we were just out of college, and I was not making much. Brenda had also just started her career and was not making much. I told Brenda that for the initial years, we would be living paycheck to paycheck. She said she was fine with it and assured me to work hard to make this work for us. A few months went very well, with both of us working to meet our needs. Life was smooth and easy for both of us. We both worked in the day, and the evenings would be all ours. Both of us made sure to spend that time well. We planned small things, or we just talked about our days. And it never got monotonous or boring for me. We earned less, but we were happy and satisfied with that. At least I am, and clearly she isn't. A year later, just after the first anniversary, money problems started creeping in. I didn't plan the anniversary as fancy as she wanted. She wanted diamonds, and I gave her a decent watch. I did whatever I could within my means and my planning ability. I agree I'm not a good planner, but she knows me better than anyone else. Instead of spending the money on outings, flowers, and food, I could have given her diamonds, but I felt memories mattered more than materialistic things. But for her, she wanted it all. I reminded her that our current financial condition doesn't allow us to have it all. After that incident, Brenda decided to work harder to make up for the financial deficiencies. I understood that deep down, she missed the luxuries she had dreamt about in her marriage. She was very vocal about it and never hid this from me. She wanted a good life, and there's no harm in that. I promised her that eventually, we would reach that level of financial state, but it takes time. You don't become rich overnight doing the right thing. But I think she's growing impatient. Brenda herself was ambitious as well as determined, and she started finding out ways and methods to make the financial condition better. She took more freelance work and gave in extra time whenever she could. Her only aim now is to make as much money as she could to fulfill all her dreams. She also enrolled in some new courses to get better paying job opportunities. I also tried my best to put in extra hours and earn more. With the months passing by, Brenda's desire for a luxurious life is driving her restless. But even after all these efforts, the difficulties remained. The only thing that happened with this struggle was the suffering. We both met in a relationship. This financial instability and Brenda's discontentment are leading to a lot of arguments between us. Brenda is finding it impossible to live with me, and she has said it to my face a lot of times. I can see that Brenda is tiring herself more than she should have, and she's compelling me to do the same. She's always exhausted by the end of the day, and it has made her very frustrated and irritable. We are not getting to spend any quality time together. I'm not happy with what is going on, but I have no other choice. As for me, I'm also managing 2 jobs to meet her demands, but the constant pressure of the finances made me frustrated, keeping my mind in a constant working mode to work out how to do better than what I'm doing. Sometimes I consider myself a failure, not being able to put up with the demands of the one person I love the most. I want to give her the best, and I'm failing in it. The constant pressure is hitting me hard. It is making me question my self-worth. If I'm not enough for her, she wanted a good life. But what constitutes a good life? Does it always have to involve materialistic things? Why can't a good life mean being happy, healthy, and abundant in love? I guess it's nice to own things. But what good is a life surrounded by nice things when it just sort of alienates you? Update 1. I should have seen this coming, but I thought just to be a financial problem came out to be a lot bigger. I never anticipated that my college love would do something like this. So, our hectic life continued for a few more months. Brenda had engrossed herself in the various jobs she had been appointed to. Things seemed to have settled between us, and things started looking brighter for us. Brenda earned quite well from her side hustles. I urged her to use that money to fulfill all her desires while I took care of the household expenses all by myself. To my amazement, Brenda was often seen in fancy dresses and accessories, happy most of the time. And all I thought this was due to her earnings, until the truth unfolded. Though she came home late, I never found her tired or lethargic. Rather, she seemed enthusiastic and more energetic for the next day. I was glad for the good tidings her busy schedule had caused. She would give me limited but wholesome time. This routine followed for a few weeks, but then something strange happened. On her return home from work one day, she was agitated. She went to bed straight and dozed off. This continued for more than a week, when it was bothering me. Whenever I asked her the reason, she would snap at me or said that she was tired of working so many hours. I told her to let herself free and get rid of the extra work. But this topic always turned into a heated argument, so I tried to avoid it. The best I could do was make her coffee and dinner and let her be in her space. I was upset, as I was now living with a machine rather than a person, a machine that worked from 8 in the morning to 10 or 11 at night. She hardly said hi or bye to me, and that's it. I was lacking her time and love. For me, money was never a priority, but for her, it was all she needed. After a lot of struggle, I made myself understand this bitter truth and learned to live with this. It was Friday, and I was running late due to additional work at the office. I texted her that I would be late. My message was left on read without any reply. I reached home around 10. Hoping she would have returned by now, but there was no sign of her. I thought she went out with friends. I didn't bother her by calling or texting because she rarely goes out. I was too tired to make dinner and dozed off on the couch waiting for her. When I woke up, it was almost midnight. I called her, but she didn't respond, and after a while, her phone was out of reach. I thought her phone had drained off. I tried her for a few more times, and in the tiredness, I dozed off again. The next morning, I got up feeling very hungry because I hadn't eaten anything since the last day's lunch. I went to the kitchen, normally looking for something to eat. My eyes fell upon a neatly folded piece of paper on the kitchen counter. When I unfolded the paper, I was shocked to see what was in my hands. It was a handwritten note from Brenda. This letter alone was enough to smash my being. Brenda had decided to leave me. The note said she found an actual man who could afford her lifestyle. The truth was bitter. The moment was so tormenting and painful that it is hard to describe. The reality seemed to haunt me. I was left shocked and jolted. I didn't know what to do or how to process this out of shock. I called Brenda's parents to ask them if they knew about her whereabouts. They denied knowing anything. I was so confused. I didn't tell them anything and hung up. My emotions choked me, and I called my friend and fumbled about my misery. He ran to my place because I sounded distraught. My condition for the next few days and a few weeks is hard to describe. I barely made it out of bed, just laid there doing nothing. I left all the other side hustles except for my full-time job because now none of it made sense. None of it was worth it. My friends and family tried to console me. My friends visited me every other day. Nights were the hardest. Eventually, I enrolled in therapy and threw myself into my work completely to avoid the thoughts about Brenda and my marriage. I worked as a distraction, as it left me no time to get sad. I was drained in all ways, but I kept exhausting myself more. With the passage of time, I began to accept my new reality. It was not easy, but I'm proud to be able to come out strong. On the journey from heartbreak to healing. It's been 4 months now since she abandoned me, and I'm yet to heal completely. But I've accepted my reality and am moving ahead in life. I'm so sorry. Opus, that's a huge kick to the groin. There's no rush in healing. Healing, like grief, is different for everyone. Please don't think you did anything wrong. You didn't. You did everything right. You were the perfect, supportive, loving husband that any woman would dream of. Update 2. Life has been so weird in the last few years that I almost forgot about this thread. After Brenda left me, it took me many months to heal. It wasn't easy. More than a year later to the D-Day, I happened to meet Alice. She was a new recruit to the office, a simple yet elegant, hardworking, enthusiastic young lady. She was a quiet being and was often seen sitting lonely in her cabin even in her free time. Her nature intrigued me. I don't know why, but I was pushed to go ahead and ask her out for coffee. She declined my offer and told me that she would like to not be bothered. She had rejected me in a confident yet respectable manner. I honored her more after that, but I didn't dare to ask her anything after that. I wasn't hitting on her. I just wanted to speak to her or maybe know her, but once she denied, I never tried again. We talked only regarding work stuff, if at all. A few months later, there was some team-building activity in the office where I and Alice were appointed from our respective teams. This gave us a chance to interact. Gradually, we became friends and opened up personal discussions. She told me about the betrayal she had received from her husband, the sole reason for her loneliness. Her husband left her for his young secretary. We realized we were both inflicted with the same trauma. We connected over our ugly past and broken hearts. Eventually, we started meeting outside the office. I felt comfortable in her company. Alice was a different girl. She understood me better. She was way more mature than my ex-wife. Though we connected over a similar past, we didn't want that to be the sole reason for our relationship. We wanted love to be the foundation of our relationship. Alice suggested couple counseling, so we took no baggage with us into our new life. We took sessions together. It has helped us to address our insecurities that had been due to the past. We took our own sweet time getting to know each other and falling in love. After being together for 2 years, I asked her out for marriage. It wasn't that I asked her out. We both knew that we wanted that, but I made the move and officially asked her to marry me. The engagement was 6 months ago. We delayed the wedding for a while as I wanted to work on my promotion first, which was due in a few months. Alice was a supportive fiancée, and she was ready to wait for me. My experience had left some insecurities, and I didn't want to lose a gem once again due to financial constraints. Alice had assured me that she was not of that type, but I didn't want to risk the chance. Last month, I got the promotion I was overdue, and it was a big day for me. Alice and I celebrated it with friends and family, and that's when we announced our wedding, which is due in 2 months. I wanted to have it immediately, but Alice suggested that we take our time for preparation and not rush into things. Since then, Alice has been busy planning for our big day bit by bit. She took up the responsibility as I'm not so good at planning stuff. Besides, she is street smart. She knows where to find the best deal in the city. It was also fun prepping for the wedding and enjoying the courtship period with Alice. But little did I know, the past was about to resurface in a way I had never expected. A few days back, Brenda reappeared in my life. However, it was not the same person. She looked miserable and shattered. It was a Sunday morning. Again, I woke up to a knock on the door. To my least expectation, there stood Brenda. It took me a while to realize it was her. I was shocked and rather upset about her sudden visit. Brenda was standing there with a sense of humility and regret. She asked me if she could come inside, and we could sit and talk. I didn't quite remember if I said yes. The entire episode with her seemed like a hazy dream. The next I remember, I was sitting on the couch opposite to her and staring at her as if she was a ghost. She indeed looked like a ghost. I mean, she looked miserable. Clearly, she hadn't been treated well. I had never seen Brenda in such a state before. He started crying bitterly and told me that she had made a huge mistake of leaving me. The man for whom she left me was nothing but a fraud. He gave her everything she wanted but respect. He treated her like trash. She liked her new life for a couple of years. She had everything: cars, clothes, accessories, exotic foreign holidays, and whatnot. But soon, she realized that the man was a cheater. He laid his hands on every other woman he met, right from his secretary to his business partner to his house attendants. When Brenda got to know the reality, it was too late. Also, she realized that their relationship was not like a normal one where she could boss him around or school him for his mistakes. He treated her no less than an inanimate object he was providing for. She was not even that close to him that she could fight with him regarding his infidelity. She just had to stay there and witness everything he did. He was a rich man in his 50s with generational wealth. What else do you expect from him? I'm not generalizing everyone, but this is how Brenda described him to be. She had bruises on her neck and hand. I asked her if that was her rich man's gift. She started crying harder and said yes. She said whenever she complained about his behaviors, he was hitting her. She said he was done living like a prisoner and had fled from his mansion some time ago. She said she wanted to stay alone and heal herself, but she had nowhere to go, and she also got to know from her family that I was remarrying Alice. Hence, she rushed to me before it was too late, as if she was not late yet. I told her that she was already very late. In fact, she closed the door of her return the moment she decided to abandon me. She begged for forgiveness and said she was a fool to run after money and not understand the value of true love. To be honest, I struggled with conflicting emotions. For a moment, I had loved this woman so dearly in the past. Deep down, the part of me that had once loved Brenda so deeply was not able to ignore the regret with which she had returned. I sat there patiently listening to what she had to say. I had just moved on and was building my new life with Alice, the woman who loved me and who had helped me heal. I cannot betray her for Brenda, who was nothing but flaky and self-centered. I asked Brenda to leave because I had to step out for a meeting with the wedding planner. She cried and held my hand, asking me for one last chance. I said I was not in a state to talk to her. She had damaged me very brutally when she ghosted me, and now she again shattered my being by mere reappearing in my life. Her presence annoyed me so much that I got up and went outside of the house, asking her to leave. She ultimately left. I slammed the door behind her. Her sudden visit brought back the memories of the past. But I was more concerned about confronting this to Alice. She wasn't in town. She went to spend a few days with her grandparents. I called her immediately. Maybe it was my guilt, but we couldn't talk much. She had network disturbances in her ancestral house. We spoke a few times after that day, but I didn't dare bring up this topic. I don't intend to hide this from her, but she's in a limited network zone, and I don't want to discuss this over a phone call. She's supposed to return tomorrow, and I'm nervous about how she's going to react to Brenda's visit. Brenda is my past, and she would never become my present or future, but I'm scared that this would ruin my chances with Alice. I'm crap scared. If you're honest and Alice is the woman you claim to be, there's nothing to worry about. Also, you wouldn't ever seriously consider going back to Brenda. There's nothing Brenda could give you that would make you happy. Alice makes you too happy. You guys have built something so special that not a lot of people can say the same. Brenda is old news. She shows the path. She's Update 3 on Update 3. Alice returned from her grandparents excited and thrilled, telling me about all the gifts and heirlooms she got from her grandparents and great-uncle. I tried to act normal, but she sensed the struggle I was going through. She knew I was distracted. She asked me politely what the matter was. It was then that I could not control myself. I blurted out everything. I told her about the unexpected return from Brenda, her regrets over the past decision, and her pleadings for another chance. Now I could see the insecurity in Alice's mind, but she kept her calm. She didn't say anything, just nodded throughout and asked me about my decision. I held her and assured her that there was nothing to decide. I never had a second thought about our marriage. I loved Alice and wanted to spend my life with her. I told her that I was nervous because I was in a dilemma, but because I feared how she would react to Brenda's visit. She acted maturely and said it didn't matter to her until I was unmoved by Brenda. A few days later, Brenda again showed up at my house. I wasn't home. Alice answered the door. Brenda lost her mind seeing Alice in the house. She asked Alice to call for me, but when she got to know that I wasn't home, she hurled abuses at Alice, accusing her of being a homewrecker. Alice said she was calm for a while and asked Brenda to come when I was there, but she kept calling her names. Alice then gave Brenda the piece of her mind. It led to a huge argument between them. When Alice threatened to call the police on Brenda. After that incident, I received several calls and texts from Brenda, but I didn't answer them all. One day, she also showed up at my workplace, but I didn't meet her after waiting for hours. When she was about to leave, she saw Alice in the office and unleashed her frustration upon her. Alice called the office security to throw out Brenda. I was feeling bad that Alice had to go through so much because of my past. I have had enough now, too. It was the time to put Brenda in her place and let her know she wasn't worth the second chance. Regrets alone don't count. I called Brenda's parents and asked her for her location. I took Alice along with me and knocked on her door. Her parents might have told her that I took her address. She answered the door excitedly, but seeing Alice with me, she turned bitter. Seeing her face, I couldn't resist my anger and frustration. I started blurting out things. I tried to keep my words less severe, but I managed to express the pain and disappointment that had been built up in me. I told her up front that I loved Alice and was going to spend the rest of my life with her, and that Brenda was no less than a ghost to me. She held my hand and cried, but I shrugged her off and asked her to stay away from me. I told that my wedding with Alice was scheduled for the next week, and that she now needed to respect my choice and decision, which solely was Alice. Now she didn't stop there and tried her last bet, texting and calling both of us to call off the wedding. She also reached out to Alice's parents to tell them I didn't love Alice and was marrying her to get back at Brenda and nothing else. When it got too much, I filed the restraining order against Brenda. After that, she has not reached out to any of us. I guess she understood that I was not going to move away from my decision. Soon, she accepts the reality. Good for her. I'm just excited to marry my love, Alice, and spend my life with her. I feel so lucky to have her in my life. Brenda went crazy, and that's no one's fault but her own. I feel bad for Alice, who got all the abuse spat at her. She didn't deserve it at all. The only thing she's guilty of is loving a man who loves her back. Honestly, she's way too kind, because anyone else would have called the cops. Brenda didn't deserve the compassion that Alice showed her. Alice sounds like the woman you've always needed in your life. So happy for the two of you. Hopefully, Brenda can bug her off and learn to live with the choices she's made. What do you think? What would you have said to Brenda upon her return? That's the story. If you liked it, please support us with a like as well as subscribe to our channel. Write in the comments what you think about the story. Thank you for being here with us.
Subscribe Relation Tales. Michael, don't forget tonight's banquet. Elizabeth called out, her voice tense as she grabbed her coat. Her gaze was sharp, her tone insistent. It's critical for my job. Michael looked up from his coffee, nodding, though his mind was elsewhere. Don't worry, I'll be there. But as the door shut behind her, Michael's expression softened, and he allowed himself a small sigh of relief. He finished his coffee, savoring the peace of an empty house before slipping into his golf attire and grabbing his clubs. Today was set for a round with his old friends, Anthony and Elliot, at their favorite course nearly an hour outside the city. After all, they hadn't had a day like this in years. Hours later, laughter echoed across the lush, manicured fairways as they reminisced over old stories and inside jokes. The autumn sun was warm, the companionship easy. By the time they finished, it was nearing dusk, but Michael's spirits were still high. He'd lost track of time completely. It wasn't until he was pulling into his driveway, well after dark, that the gravity of the evening hit him. The banquet. Elizabeth's banquet. As he stepped into the living room, her voice struck like a slap in the face. I told you this was important. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, fury blazing in her eyes. You knew how much this meant to me, Michael. Michael paused, raising his hands in a placating gesture, trying to make light of the situation. I'm sorry, love. Traffic was terrible. You know how it is? Her expression was unmoved. Funny, I talked to Jeffrey, and he told me you left work hours early. Left your phone right on the kitchen counter. Not even reachable. She took a step closer, her voice rising. So, why don't you tell me the truth for once? Caught, Michael sighed, forcing a faint smile. All right, you got me. I went golfing with Anthony and Elliot. It was just a day with the guys. No big deal. No big deal. Elizabeth repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. You missed one of the biggest nights of my career for a game of golf? He tried to laugh it off, but Elizabeth's face was cold, unreadable. She stood for a moment, her jaw tight, before turning on her heel. You know what? I'm done, she said, her voice steady, but the bitterness cut through. You can sleep in the guest room. Don't bother talking to me. In the following days, an icy silence settled over the house. Elizabeth threw sharp looks his way and rarely spoke, making her anger crystal clear. Michael, though annoyed by her reaction, brushed it off, focusing instead on work and his own routine. But soon, her behavior shifted. She began staying out late, mumbling vague explanations about work events or drinks with colleagues. Initially, Michael dismissed it. Elizabeth had always been driven and independent. But as the days wore on, her absences became more frequent, her excuses flimsy, and he couldn't shake a growing unease. One night, curiosity got the better of him. After a tense exchange at dinner, he stayed up, pacing the living room until midnight, waiting for her return. When she finally stepped through the door, he noticed her slightly flushed cheeks, her hair tousled, her expression distant. Late night, he asked casually, though his tone was tight. She barely looked at him. Just drinks with the team, she replied, brushing past him. But her response didn't sit right. Something about her gaze, the way it slid away from his, felt wrong. For the first time, he wondered if there was something more going on. He knew he'd missed the banquet, but her coldness, her evasiveness, this was something else entirely. Driven by his suspicions, Michael began to watch her more closely. Elizabeth seemed distracted, spending an unusual amount of time on her phone, which she now guarded closely. Her work nights grew later. Her laughter during brief phone calls edged with something unfamiliar. Each new detail added weight to his suspicions. It wasn't until one Saturday afternoon, when he happened to glance at her phone on the counter as she showered, that he found the proof he'd been dreading. A message from her boss, Robert, flashed on the screen. Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again. Michael's heart twisted painfully. The implications were clear, but he fought the urge to react. Instead, he forced his expression to remain neutral, quietly setting the phone back down. He knew now that his suspicions were correct, but he also knew he'd need more evidence, proof that Elizabeth couldn't deny. From that day on, he moved with careful precision, methodically collecting information. He noted her weekends away, hired a private investigator to gather photos, and slowly built a case of undeniable betrayal. It was almost as if he'd become a ghost in his own marriage, watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to confront her. But instead of anger, a cold calm settled over him, a feeling that grew with every piece of evidence he amassed. With the evidence he needed in hand, Michael made plans for his next move. He contacted Elizabeth's parents, inviting them to lunch that Saturday, casually arranging the meeting at a place he knew Elizabeth and Robert frequented. When the day arrived, he maintained an air of casual conversation, discussing harmless topics over lunch as they waited for Elizabeth and Robert to show. Just as he'd anticipated, they arrived at the restaurant together, their hands touching as they exchanged a laugh. Michael's heart hardened, but he kept his expression neutral, guiding Elizabeth's parents' gaze in their direction. The moment they saw her, shock registered on their faces. Elizabeth, caught off guard, froze, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she registered the sight of her parents. And Michael, his eyes cold and fixed on her. "What is this?" she managed to stammer, her face pale. "Oh, just a lunch with family," Michael replied smoothly, his voice devoid of warmth. "Though I imagine you were expecting something more private." Elizabeth's face drained of color, her gaze shifting to her parents, who stared back in disbelief and disappointment. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the full weight of what she had done. That evening, Michael waited in the living room, a neat stack of papers, the evidence he'd gathered, resting on the coffee table. When Elizabeth finally returned home, her steps hesitant and slow, he gestured to the seat across from him, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said quietly, motioning to the photos, the messages he'd collected, each one a clear betrayal. Elizabeth's eyes filled with dread as she looked at the incriminating evidence, but she attempted to hold her composure. "It was a mistake, Michael," she whispered. "I never meant for you to find out. It didn't mean anything." Michael's jaw clenched, but he remained calm. "You threw away 24 years of marriage, Elizabeth. You destroyed everything we built. For what? A fling." Tears welled in her eyes, but he was unmoved. When you were furious with me for missing that banquet, I felt terrible. I regretted it. But now I realize that no matter what I did, you would have found a reason to push me away. You had already checked out of this marriage long before then." Elizabeth's face crumpled, her hands trembling. "Please, Michael, we can work through this. It was just a lapse in judgment." Michael shook his head, his voice steady. "A lapse in judgment?" He gestured to the photos and messages. "This is more than a lapse, Elizabeth. This is betrayal." She fell silent, her defenses shattered. He stood, gathering the divorce papers from the coffee table, and placed them before her. "I want you to leave. My lawyer will reach out on Monday," he said, his voice final. "The prenuptial agreement will leave you with exactly what you came into this marriage with. You've made your choices, and now you'll live with them." Elizabeth broke into sobs, pleading, but Michael's expression remained stony. His decision was made. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal. Elizabeth's reputation, once respected, was tarnished by whispers of her affair. Her friends and family began to distance themselves, the story of her betrayal spreading quickly. Michael, meanwhile, felt a mix of relief and emptiness as he moved on, the satisfaction of his carefully planned revenge only slightly dulled by the loss of a life he'd once valued. In the end, he had given Elizabeth exactly what she wanted: freedom. But it had come at a price she hadn't anticipated, and as Michael walked away, he felt the weight of betrayal lift, leaving him ready to start anew, alone but liberated. Days after the confrontation, the house felt emptier than ever, despite Elizabeth's presence still lingering like a phantom. The silence between them was suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional exchange of harsh words. Michael maintained his usual calm demeanor, though inside, a storm was brewing. He couldn't forget the look in her eyes when he handed her the divorce papers. There was fear, but also something else, regret, perhaps. But for Michael, regret was too little, too late. The betrayal had cut deep, and his decision was final. Yet even as he felt vindicated, a gnawing emptiness remained. Revenge had been sweet, but it hadn't filled the void. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, who had once been so confident and self-assured, was unraveling. The fallout from her affair spread like wildfire, rumors poisoning her reputation at work, and whispers of her dishonesty followed her everywhere. Her once prominent position at the company was slipping through her fingers, the consequences of her actions catching up with her faster than she had anticipated. One evening, Michael came home to find her sitting in the living room, her eyes swollen from crying, her usually impeccable appearance disheveled. She looked at him with a mix of pleading and exhaustion. "Michael," her voice cracked. "Please, can we talk?" He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. "There's nothing left to talk about. Please don't say that," she implored, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm losing everything. I never thought it would end like this. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry. I want to fix this." Michael's heart hardened at her words. She wasn't sorry for him. She was sorry for herself. "You've lost your job," he said coldly. "Your reputation is in tatters. The world knows about your affair. But you never once considered the consequences for us. For this marriage." I know," she said, wiping away fresh tears. "But I'm asking for a chance to make it right. Please, Michael, don't throw everything away. Michael's eyes narrowed. You had your chance. But now it's over. He walked past her, his back turned to her frantic pleas. He could hear her sobbing behind him, but he didn't turn around. He had to be strong. He had to hold his ground. The next few days passed in a blur. Michael's divorce lawyer was relentless, sending Elizabeth the paperwork to sign and making it clear that there was no negotiating the terms. Her prenuptial agreement, something she had once scoffed at, was now her greatest liability. At work, Elizabeth's downfall continued. Her affair with Robert had been exposed to her colleagues, and the once promising future she had envisioned with him now seemed like a distant, naive dream. Rumors circulated, and her reputation became the subject of gossip among those she had once considered friends. Her calls to Michael went unanswered, and when she did manage to catch him at home, he remained cold and distant. Then, one morning, Elizabeth arrived home unexpectedly, her face pale, her clothes wrinkled from what appeared to be a sleepless night. I don't know where to go," she whispered. "No one will speak to me. Not even Robert. He's ignoring my calls." Michael, who had been sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, looked up at her with an unreadable expression. "I don't know what you want from me, Elizabeth," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I can't help you now. You made your bed." "I never thought it would come to this," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think it would all fall apart so quickly." Michael stood up, tossing the paper aside. "That's the thing about betrayal, Elizabeth. You never see the consequences until it's too late." Michael's revenge was almost complete, but there was one final act left to execute. The lavish new TV he had bought, the one he had so carefully positioned in their living room, had been a symbolic gesture, but he knew he had one more chance to assert his control. He reached out to a mutual friend of Elizabeth's and Robert's, a woman named Barbara, who had been privy to Robert's philandering ways. With Barbara's help, Michael planned the ultimate humiliation, a staged accidental meeting between Elizabeth and Robert's wife. It took several weeks to arrange, but when the day arrived, it was everything Michael had hoped for. Elizabeth, with her fragile composure, arrived at a cafe where Robert's wife had been invited for a casual brunch. The setup was flawless. As Elizabeth walked in, her eyes widening in recognition, she found herself face to face with Robert's wife, who greeted her with a cold smile. "What a surprise," she said, her voice laced with thinly veiled contempt. "I didn't expect to run into you here." Elizabeth froze, her blood running cold as the realization hit. The woman didn't know about her affair with Robert. She knew about the affair and was now confronting her with it. As Michael watched from a nearby table, his heart pounded in his chest. He knew this moment would be the breaking point for Elizabeth. Her face drained of color, and her eyes flickered in panic. But there was nothing she could do now. The truth had been laid bare. Michael left the cafe before Elizabeth even noticed him. He didn't need to witness the fallout. He knew exactly what would happen next. Elizabeth's reputation would crumble even further. There was no escaping her actions now. A week later, Elizabeth moved out, leaving the house they had shared for so many years. Michael didn't watch her pack her things, nor did he stay for the tearful pleas that followed. He had already made up his mind. As he sat in the living room, staring at the oversized TV that now dominated the room, Michael reflected on everything that had led up to this point. Revenge had been sweet, but it hadn't filled the hole left by the betrayal. There was no satisfaction in her defeat, only a cold, hollow emptiness. The door clicked shut behind her as she left, taking with her the last remnants of their life together. Michael stood there, watching the door, unsure of what came next. But he knew one thing for certain: he was done. There was no turning back now. With a final glance at the empty space where their marriage once stood, Michael felt the weight of the past lift. For the first time in months, he could breathe again. The revenge was over. The consequences were hers to bear. The days following Elizabeth's departure were strange for Michael, both liberating and unsettling. The house, once filled with the hum of daily life and Elizabeth's voice, was eerily silent. Yet there was something cathartic in the quiet. The weight of betrayal that had clung to him for months was finally gone. Though the relief was tempered by a sense of melancholy, he hadn't anticipated. Elizabeth had packed up most of her things quickly, leaving behind only a few personal items scattered around. An old scarf draped over the back of a chair, her favorite perfume bottle abandoned on the bathroom counter. Michael didn't bother to collect these remnants. He let them stay where they were. The house felt cleaner somehow, purged of the dishonesty that had infected it. He even started to enjoy the freedom of making decisions without consulting anyone. But as the weeks passed, he began to wonder about the aftermath of his revenge. Elizabeth had left, but was she truly gone from his life? The emotional scars would take much longer to heal. And there was a part of Michael that still couldn't shake the image of her face when she realized everything had been laid bare. Work had become a distraction, a way to keep his mind occupied, but even that wasn't enough to drown out the questions that swirled in his head. Had he gone too far? Was he truly better off without her? Or had he simply been consumed by the need for retribution? One evening, as he was sitting at his desk, a knock at the door startled him. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly 9 p.m. He stood up confused. No one visited him this late. When he opened the door, his breath caught. There, standing on the doorstep, was Elizabeth. She looked different, broken, fragile, and smaller than he remembered. Her eyes were red from crying, her cheeks hollowed, as though the weight of her own regret had aged her. She held a small bag in her hand, her fingers nervously clutching the strap. "I didn't know where else to go," Elizabeth said quietly, her voice trembling. "Can I come in? Just for a minute?" Michael hesitated, the storm of emotions rising in him. But he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter, though he kept his distance. He hadn't seen her in weeks, and seeing her here, after everything, stirred up feelings he wasn't prepared to confront. She sat down on the couch without waiting for an invitation, her shoulders hunched in defeat. "I've lost everything, Michael. My job, my friends, my reputation. And now even Robert has abandoned me." Michael remained silent, studying her. The woman who had once stood so confident before him was now a shell of that person. He could see it clearly. Elizabeth had no one left to turn to. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need to say I'm sorry. I don't know how I could have been so blind, so selfish. I betrayed you in the worst possible way, and I can't undo it. But I need you to know that I'm sorry." Her words were like a dagger to Michael's heart. She was sorry, not for the damage she had caused him, but for the consequences she had to face. She was sorry because her own world had crumbled around her, not because she had destroyed his. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "You don't get to come here and play the victim, Elizabeth," he said, his voice colder than he intended. "You made your choices. You knew exactly what you were doing when you crossed that line with Robert. And now, you have to deal with the fallout. I'm done." Elizabeth flinched but didn't protest. Instead, she looked down at her hands, as though seeing them for the first time. "I never thought it would come to this," she said again, almost to herself. "I thought I could keep everything under control. But I didn't realize what I had until it was gone." Michael was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on her, a mix of anger and pity swirling inside him. He had gotten everything he'd set out to achieve, his revenge, her downfall, the exposure of her betrayal. But he still felt empty. This wasn't how he had imagined it would feel. "Are you happy now?" she asked, her voice suddenly strong, though her eyes betrayed her vulnerability. "Is this what you wanted? To see me lose everything? To watch me break?" Michael stared at her, feeling the weight of her question. Was he happy? He couldn't answer her. What was the point of all of it? What had it truly solved? He had taken pleasure in exposing her infidelity, in dismantling her life. But now, with her sitting there before him, broken, regretful, he wasn't so sure it had been worth it. "No," he said quietly, his voice softer than before. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to see you fall apart. I just wanted you to feel what I felt, to understand how it feels to be betrayed." Elizabeth met his gaze, her face a mask of regret. "I understand, and I'll live with that pain for the rest of my life." Michael swallowed hard, his throat tight. The anger that had driven him all these months began to dissolve, replaced by an emptiness he couldn't quite explain. The next few weeks were a blur. Elizabeth moved in with a friend, trying to rebuild the pieces of her life. Michael didn't see her again after that night. He threw himself into work, and slowly, the numbness he had felt began to subside. Eventually, the weight of his revenge no longer hung over him. Elizabeth had left, her reputation tarnished, her life in ruins, just as he had intended. But as the days turned into months, Michael realized that there was no satisfaction in watching someone else's misery. It was as if, in seeking justice for his betrayal, he had lost something far more important: his own peace of mind. He spent the next few months trying to reconcile with himself, trying to figure out what kind of person he had become. The need for revenge had consumed him, but in the end, it had only left him more isolated. And then, one day, he woke up, and the thought that had been creeping in for weeks became impossible to ignore. It was time to let go. Time to move forward. Again, don't bother coming to this one, Liz said, her smile wavering like a lie caught mid-breath. The words hung between us, casual yet calculated, as if testing the strength of the air they traveled through. 3 days before the company party, that was when my world, perfectly framed like a portrait on the wall, began to crack. My name is Albert Brown. I'm 46 years old, a seasoned account manager for a thriving manufacturing firm. To anyone who asked, I had it all: a 25-year marriage to my high school sweetheart, Elizabeth, or Liz as everyone called her, a sprawling lakefront home near Arlington, a daughter, Maria, so ambitious she was already engaged to William, a young man from a family far wealthier than ours. But the truth of a perfect life is that its fractures are often invisible until they aren't. That night, as Liz dismissed my attendance with that polished smile, something about her struck me as off. Her words had no warmth, no real interest in my presence. Just a polite dismissal, as if to say, don't concern yourself with my world. For 25 years, I had trusted Liz like the sky trusts the horizon, bound together despite our differences. But in that moment, something small but sharp pierced through me. An instinct, a flicker of doubt, lit a spark in my chest. Still, I ignored it. After all, Liz was Liz, my partner, my confidant, the woman who once shared ramen noodles with me in a dingy college apartment and laughed as if it were a feast. But that Saturday night at the party was where it all unraveled. Liz had always been stunning, with blonde hair that refused to gray and piercing blue eyes that lit up a room. But that night, in a sleek black dress that hugged every curve, she wasn't just stunning, she was performing. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't for me. We arrived at the venue, a glittering banquet hall buzzing with energy, and the first thing I noticed was how everyone's gaze lingered on her. Liz always had a way of commanding attention, but tonight, the air was different. People weren't just admiring her. They were complicit. And then I saw him. The man was in his early 50s, his gray hair combed back with a precision that mirrored his arrogance. He exuded confidence, too much of it, like he belonged to a world where rules bent around his desires. His suit was tailored to perfection, and the smirk on his face sent a chill down my spine. He made a beeline for Liz, cutting through the crowd like a shark in still waters. Before I could even process what was happening, Liz turned toward him with a smile that wasn't hers, not the one I knew. This smile was warmer, more intimate, and it sliced through me like a blade. Albert, she said, her voice light, almost dismissive. This is Chad Smith, one of my sales reps. Chad extended his hand, and I took it out of politeness. His grip was firm, his smile overly friendly. I've heard so much about you, he said, though his eyes barely glanced at me. His attention was fixed on Liz, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenient shadow. Likewise, I lied. For the next hour, I watched. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help myself. Liz floated around the room, charming everyone with her effortless charisma. She always had a knack for making people feel special. But tonight, her attention kept drifting to one person, Chad. Every glance, every laugh shared between them, felt like a slap across my face. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was overthinking, letting my paranoia twist harmless interactions into something sinister. But then came the dance floor. Liz loved to dance, and we had always been a good pair. I led, she followed. Tonight, though, as we swayed to the music, her movements felt stiff, distracted. Her eyes weren't on me, they were scanning the crowd. And when I turned her in a slow spin, I saw where her gaze landed. Chad stood at the edge of the dance floor, his arms crossed, his smirk infuriatingly smug. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting. When we returned to our table, I tried to shake off the unease. Liz excused herself to get another drink, and I watched her weave through the crowd, her black dress catching the light with every step. And then, as if pulled by some invisible force, Chad followed. They met at the bar, their conversation too quiet for anyone but them. I saw her lean in closer, her lips moving in words I couldn't hear. But I didn't need to hear them. Her body language, the slight tilt of her head, the way her hand brushed his arm, it all screamed of familiarity. And then I caught it, one word that changed everything. Darling. She said it softly, almost tenderly, and it echoed in my mind like a gunshot. My heart raced, my hands clenched into fists onto the table. Every instinct screamed at me to confront them, to march up to that bar and demand an explanation. But I stayed seated, frozen by the weight of realization. This wasn't a hunch. It wasn't paranoia. This was betrayal. The days that followed were a blur of suspicion and anger, each one worse than the last. Liz carried on as if nothing had changed, her smile as warm as ever, her touch just as familiar. But I couldn't shake the images from that night. The glances, the whispers, the word darling. I needed answers. Real answers. So, I did what any man would do when the foundation of his life begins to crack. I sought the truth. Hiring David Carter, a private investigator, was a decision born out of desperation. He came highly recommended, a no-nonsense professional with a reputation for discretion. I told him everything. The party, Chad, the moments that didn't add up. Find out if there's anything to find, I told him, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. David didn't waste time. Within days, he sent me the first set of photos. I stared at them in disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest. Liz and Chad, walking into a motel. Liz and Chad, kissing in the parking lot. Liz and Chad, smiling as if the world belonged to them. Each photo was a punch to the gut, each one chipping away at the woman I thought I knew. I wanted to confront her right then, to shove the evidence in her face and demand answers. But I held back. David was thorough, and I needed the full picture. The evidence piled up over the next few weeks. More photos, video recordings, even audio clips. It wasn't just a fling. It was a calculated, ongoing affair. They met during lunch breaks, after work, even on weekends. But the worst part? The recordings. Hearing Liz laugh about their office wife arrangement made my blood boil. Albert would never suspect, she said in one clip, her tone casual, dismissive. He's too busy with work to notice. That stung more than anything else. She thought I was a fool, a man too blind to see the truth right in front of him. But she underestimated me. By the time David handed me his final report, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't just confront her. I wouldn't just demand answers. I would make her regret ever underestimating me. The envelope sat heavy on the kitchen table the next morning, a silent accusation wrapped in manila. Liz hummed softly as she flipped pancakes on the stove, the smell of butter and syrup wafting through the air. It was an ordinary morning, a routine that had played out countless times in our 25 years together. Except this time, I wasn't the same man sitting at the table. Liz, I began, my voice calm but laced with ice. You'd never betray me, right? She froze, her hand gripping the spatula mid-flip. Slowly, she turned to face me, her blue eyes wide with something that almost looked like guilt before she covered it with a practiced smile. Of course not, Albert. Why would you even ask that? I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I reached into the envelope and pulled out the first photo, sliding it across the table. Her smile faltered as she stared at the image. What is this? She whispered, her voice trembling. You tell me, I replied, sliding another photo across the table. And then another. With each one, her face drained of color, her composure cracking like a fragile mask. Albert, I can explain. Explain what? My voice was calm, steady, but every word carried the weight of my fury. That you've been sneaking around behind my back? That you've been lying to me for over a year? It's not what it looks like, she stammered, her hands trembling as she reached for the photos. I don't love him. It's just physical. It doesn't mean anything. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. It doesn't mean anything? You destroyed 25 years of marriage for something that doesn't mean anything. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. For the first time, her pain didn't matter to me. The woman standing before me wasn't my Liz. She was a stranger, a liar. She launched into a flurry of excuses, her voice desperate. She talked about loneliness, about how she felt neglected, about how she thought I wouldn't notice. Every word felt like another knife twisting in my gut. Stop, I said, my voice cold. I've heard enough. Liz looked at me, her tears falling freely now. Albert, I made a mistake. Please, we can fix this. I still love you, but love didn't mean the same thing anymore. Not after what she'd done. You want to fix this? I leaned in, my eyes locking onto hers. Then start by packing your things. You're leaving. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She stared at me as if I'd struck her, but I didn't flinch. For 25 years, I had given her everything, my trust, my loyalty, my love. And now I was taking it back. If confronting Liz had been painful, what came next was worse. Maria, my daughter, my pride and joy, called me the next day. Her voice was filled with concern, but not for me. Dad, she began cautiously, Mom told me you had a fight. What's going on? I hesitated for a moment before telling her everything. Liz's affair, Chad, the evidence. I didn't hold back. Maria listened in silence, and for a brief moment, I thought she might understand. But her response shattered me. Dad, it's not that big of a deal, she said, her tone dismissive. People have affairs all the time. It's not the end of the world. Not a big deal? I repeated, incredulous. Your mother betrayed me. She lied to me for over a year. Maria sighed, as if I were the one being unreasonable. Look, I'm not saying it's okay, but maybe you're overreacting. Mom loves you. She just made a mistake. A mistake? My voice was rising, anger bubbling to the surface. She destroyed our family, Maria. How is that just a mistake? And then she said the words that would haunt me. Maybe you should just let it go, Dad. It's not like you've been perfect either. I was speechless. My own daughter, the person I had sacrificed so much for, was defending Liz. The final blow came when Maria casually added, Oh, by the way, Mom and I were talking, and we think Chad should come to the wedding. He's important to her. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. If Chad is at your wedding, I said, my voice icy, then I won't be. Dad, don't be ridiculous. I'm serious, Maria. If he's there, I'm not. And with that, I hung up. Liz's betrayal was one thing. Maria's was another. But together, they lit a fire in me that refused to die. I wasn't just angry. I was determined. They thought they could walk all over me. That I would sit back and let them humiliate me. That I'd play the fool while they carried on. They were wrong. I started planning in secret, every step methodical and deliberate. Liz had no idea how much control I had over our finances. While she played house with Chad, I moved everything I could, our savings, our investments, into accounts she couldn't trace. I refinanced the house, took out loans, and left the debts in her name. The BMW she loved so much, I borrowed against it, leaving her to deal with the fallout. But that was just the beginning. Liz and Maria wanted to rebuild their lives without me. Fine, but I'd make sure they started from the ground up. Every night, I sat across from Liz at the dinner table, playing the part of a husband willing to move forward. She smiled, made small talk, and acted as if she'd won. She thought my confrontation had been the climax, the storm that passed. Little did she know, I was the eye of the hurricane. Over the next few weeks, I executed my plan with precision. I withdrew the maximum allowable funds from our shared accounts, transferring them to offshore accounts under names she would never recognize. Liz wasn't financially savvy. She left all the financial planning to me. That ignorance was now her downfall. Meanwhile, I handled our home. 15 years ago, we had purchased it outright. a fact Liz loved to brag about to her friends. What she didn't know was that I'd refinanced it multiple times over the years for investments she never asked about. I secured a new loan for $2 million, tying it solely to her name. Her beloved BMW? That was next. I took out a loan against the car, secured $40,000, and funneled it into my private account. By the time I was done, every major asset we owned was mortgaged or tied to debts she'd be responsible for. Liz didn't notice a thing, too caught up in her fantasy life with Chad to see the storm brewing on the horizon. Maria's wedding was supposed to be the culmination of everything she'd ever dreamed of, a grand affair with no expense spared. I'd initially agreed to fund the event, signing off on lavish decorations, a live band, and an open bar. But Maria's dismissal of my pain and her defense of Chad had soured everything. One morning, I made a call to the wedding planner. "Hi, this is Albert Brown," I said. "I won't be funding the wedding anymore. You'll need to discuss payment with Maria or her mother." There was a long pause on the other end. "Mr. Brown, the deposits." "Keep them," I said, cutting her off. "Consider it compensation for your trouble." I hung up, my chest tight with anger. If Maria wanted Chad at her wedding, she could let him foot the bill. I wasn't done. Maria's fiancé, William, was a decent young man from a respectable family. I decided he deserved to know the truth about what he was walking into. I called him, arranging a meeting at a nearby cafe. Over coffee, I laid everything out. The affair, Maria's casual dismissal of it, her insistence on having Chad at the wedding. I even played him the audio recordings of Maria saying, "It's not a big deal. Men cheat all the time." William's face darkened with every word. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally, his voice steady but pained. "I had no idea." 2 days later, Maria called me in tears. "William called off the wedding," she sobbed. "Why would you do this to me, Dad?" "You did this to yourself, Maria," I said, my voice cold. "You chose to side with your mother and her affair partner. Now live with the consequences." The first cracks in Liz's world appeared a week after I walked out. The loan against the house went through, and the bank wasted no time contacting her. Liz called me in a panic, but I didn't answer. Her second call came after the BMW payments started piling up. Then came the credit card bills, now maxed out from the wedding deposits and her lavish spending. Chad wasn't much help. His wife, armed with the evidence I had anonymously sent her, filed for divorce. She was a major shareholder in the advertising agency where Chad worked, and she used her influence to have him fired. Overnight, he went from a hotshot sales rep to a middle-aged man driving for a rideshare company. Liz's reputation crumbled. I forwarded evidence of the affair to her boss, along with transcripts of her mocking office policies and deadlines. The agency couldn't afford the scandal and let her go. Within 2 months, Liz and Maria were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a rough part of town. From what I heard, Liz took a job as a waitress at a roadside diner, her once perfect nails chipped and her blonde hair dull. Maria, having lost her wealthy fiancé and the dream wedding, was working part-time at a coffee shop, her college tuition now her responsibility. I settled in Florida, far away from the wreckage I'd left behind. The sun was warm, the beaches endless, and the people didn't know me or my past. My finances were secure, tucked safely in offshore accounts, and I lived simply but comfortably. I bought a truck and a travel trailer, both in cash, and registered them under my cousin's name. Every so often, I'd hear whispers about Liz and Maria. They were struggling, barely making ends meet. Chad had vanished into obscurity, his life just as miserable as theirs. But I didn't feel pity. For 25 years, I had been the rock, the provider, the one who kept everything together. When they chose to betray me, they underestimated what I was capable of. Now, as I watched the waves crash against the shore, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. They had their choices, and I had mine.